Another Souls marathon is now complete. We beat every game only using miracles, and compared to the pyromancy marathon I did, they definitely don't have as good as damaging options, but arguably the best part about miracles are their support-based spells, because you get access to things like healing or damage negation spells, which I don't really ever use anyway, but it's still cool. But yes, this is just going to be a PvE-based list, and if you have any opinions, just let me know down in the comments. Starting off right at the bottom, we have Demon Souls, which was a pretty easy pick. The first iteration of miracles were definitely not that strong. The main reason being is that there's only one damaging option in God's Wrath, which is essentially like your Wrath of the Gods from the other games, but just nowhere near as good due to its really long animation that you can get staggered out of, it costing 100 MP and its mediocre damage. But yeah, there's no lightning spells because lightning damage isn't a thing in this game, and everything magic or fire damage related falls under the magic category. Now the only spell of which you really have to worry about is a Second Chance. This is the best miracle spell in the game, because this spell revives your character when you hit 0 HP and puts you back at 50% health, and after you trigger the effect, you can just recast it again for 100 MP. And honestly, I don't think I have to describe why having a second's life is a good thing in this game, but yeah, unfortunately, this is where like the Demon Souls miracles peak, because only thing else you really get are like healing spells and curing status effect spells. All weapon buffs, stealth spells, and damage negation spells fall under magic. Now your healing spells, they can be pretty decent. Regeneration is 1% HP per second for 100 seconds. The basic heal spell is good enough to carry you throughout the entire game, and the status curing spells are cool, but the thing is about spells in this game is that they cost MP, and the only way to replenish them is by purchasing spice with some souls, which you can just buy heals and antidotes for souls, and these just have a better effect. They have quicker cast, they don't take up a spell slot. Now yeah, they are going to be a little bit more expensive compared to the spice, but it's not that much more to where it's really worth using or to be able to spec into a miracle based build. And the best thing about specking into a faith build is not necessarily the miracles, but just the blessed infusions that you actually get with weapons. But as for the rest of the spells, you do have evacuation, which is essentially like a spell based version of an Arcstone Shard, which is actually really good because Arcstone Shards are just way overpriced. And the rest of the spells are basically just for PvP. You have spells that can send invaders or summons home, a spell to stop magic being used around you, or a spell to hide yourself from invaders, which is cool to have when the online was active, but today it's just kind of useless. Next up, we have Dark Souls 1 Miracles, which is definitely a massive improvement over the Demon Souls variant because you have much more damaging and support-based options, and also that is a lot more accessible earlier on in the game. Now, it does have one major downside that I will get into, but to start off with your damaging spells, your best one is going to be Wrath of the Gods. It's a quick casting AoE spell that does magic damage, covers a large radius, deflects spells, and does a lot of damage for only taking up one slot. Now, unfortunately, all your other spells are pretty mediocre except for maybe Lightning Spear. It can perform pretty good, but that casting speed can definitely get you killed. Sunlight Spear is a much better version, but that's only accessible in New Game Plus. Gravelord Dance is a nice AoE, but it doesn't hit multiple times to an enemy, so against bosses, it's going to be kind of useless. Karmic Justice sucks ass, but it's still a better version than its Elden Ring counterpart, and Emit Force is something that you only really use in a fight against enemies that are resist to lightning. Now, in terms of your support-based spells, weapon buffs like Lightning Blade or Darkmoon Blade are just amazing to have, but you do only get one cast. Your healing spells are also really good, and as I mentioned earlier, having healing spells tied to limited casts are just much better than when it's tied to FP or MP. But in Dark Souls 1, you get 20 healing flasks already, which is like more than enough to heal your character. So healing spells don't offer much in a PvE setting. But if I'm to talk about the worst thing about miracles in Dark Souls 1 and why they're lower on the list, is that there's not many spells to begin with, and they definitely do like a damage boosting option, but most of the spells are just tied to covenants, which requires online play or ridiculous amounts of farming. Lightning Spear, Gravelord Dance requires you to join a covenant, which is not too bad, but Great Lightning Spear, Gravelord, Greatsword Dance, and Darkmoon Blade require you to rank up those covenants. And even worse than that, some spells require you to stay in those covenants just to benefit. If you have a fully ranked up Gravelord Covenant, then those spells will just do bonus damage. And if you leave, you actually get a damage penalty, which is the exact same with Darkmoon Blade as well. And if you want to get Sunlight Blade, you're going to have to leave the Darkmoon Blade Covenant, and you won't be able to join again until New Game Plus. And then there's spells like Soothing Sunlight or Sunlight Spear. Those spells actually require you to stay in the Covenant, otherwise they won't work at all. Like for Sunlight Spear, you have to kill the final boss, rank up the Warriors of Sunlight Covenant to level 3, and then stay in the Covenant, otherwise you won't be able to use it. And this is like one of your best spells to have. So yeah, miracle builds can be very viable, but they're definitely frustrating to make, and it's especially annoying when you compare them to pyromancies or sorceries and realize how accessible those are compared to these ones. Number 3, we have Dark Souls 2 Miracles, which is basically the exact same thing as Dark Souls 1, but with just less variety. You're missing the Gravelord spells and Darkmoon Blade, but they have been replaced with Sacred Oath and Heavenly Thunder, which honestly I prefer. But yeah, All the other spells are very much the exact same. The damage negation, healing spells are all still there. And honestly, they're just more useful in this game because your Estus Flask just sucks. But in terms of lightning speed compared to Dark Souls 1, you have a much faster animation and the spell just goes much further. And I mean like really far distances, like it could go super duper far. But the major downside is that once again, you just always have such little amounts of casts in this game to the point where it's like almost impossible to be a pure caster outside of a boss fight or a new game plus. But thank God for the attunement glitch and giving my Heavenly Thunders 30 whole casts, which this spell can hit the same enemy multiple times, so bosses will just get shredded or just completely dodge it due to its RNG nature. But the main reason why all these lightning spells perform so well is because lightning damage is really good. So many bosses are just weak to it and hardly anything is resist. So that's why you always see people going around with lightning infusions and sunlight blade, which is another great spell and arguably does better than its Dark Souls 1 counterpart due to it getting more casts. Now there is a spell that has gotten worse from Dark Souls 1 and that is Wrath of the Gods. Not only has it lost its fast animation, but it also gets much worse range, has less casts, and does worse damage, which you probably wouldn't even get this spell anyway due to it being tied behind New Game Plus 2 or Covenant rewards, which once again is very annoying, but it is still not as bad as Dark Souls 1 because you don't need to be in the Covenant to benefit. It is also easier to farm the Covenant items, and there's not many spells that are tied to it. Wrath of the Gods, Soothing Sunlight, and Sunlight Spear being your only ones, which it does suck for Sunlight Spear because that's probably like your best miracle to have. And also, this is the only game where there's no ring that actually boosts miracle damage. And with how high the requirements are for some of these spells, you're going to have to spec into a lot of faith. Now, as for your most important support spells, you have Sacred Oath and Denial. Sacred Oath is more physical damage and physical damage negation, and Denial is kind of like Second Chance from Demon Souls, but instead of reviving you with half health, it would leave you at 1 HP. Now, both of these spells are incredibly useful, but unfortunately both are acquired somewhat later into the playthrough and take up 3 and 4 spell slots respectively. So yes, a lot of stat investment is required. Now another downside to mention is that this game introduced having to level up your spell catalysts, which I guess is balanced, but yeah, in Dark Souls 1, your talisman didn't need upgrading, but in this game you do, which can suck, especially if your chime and weapons both require Twinkling Titanite, because there's no way you can buy an infinite amount of them, which unfortunately your best chime requires Twinkling Titanite and it is acquired after killing Dark Lurker, which is not like a hard boss, but just doing those dungeons are just very annoying. But yeah, overall Dark Souls 2 spells are very powerful and fun, but they're just not going to be as good as the next two. Number 2, Elden Ring, which yes, technically they're not miracles, but we can go ahead and create our own miracles category. Erd Tree, Golden Order, and Two Finger Incantations are definitely miracles, obviously because they're yellow. Now, lightning is a bit weird in this game, but I guess we can classify them as miracles as well. Now, I'm not going to talk about every single spell here. I did is rank all 101 incantations, so you can check that video out if you want to. But to start off with the support spells, Golden Vow is just the best one. It's just a better version of Sacred Oath from the previous games. All the healing spells are definitely best in this game, but yes, once again, I do prefer them to have limited casts, because the way it is right now, you have to sacrifice healing flasks for FP flasks just so you can get more heals. Now, these still have very good use in this game due to its synergy in co-op. Spirit Ashes just give these spells a lot more use compared to what they had in the previous games. Damage negation spells are just best in this game as well because typically you only get magic damage negation, but now you get spells for every damage type, and the cheaper ones have such low faith requirements that you could just use these with every type of build. But as for the damaging options, you do get good variety in damage types. The lightning ones will just be the best because not only is lightning damage just better than all the other elements, but the spells themselves are amazing. Ancient Dragon's Lightning Strike just one-shots everything. Lightning Spear is a quick, cheap projectile. Frozen Lightning Spear gives you a nice frost option, and you also do get the best weapon buff in Electrify Armament, but weapon buffs in this game are just not as useful compared to the others, and I did wish they brought back Sunlight Spear. Just having a beefed up, more expensive Lightning Spear is just always nice. They honestly could have brought it back in the form of Radagon Spear, but I guess they just hate us, which does lead me into the Golden Order incantations. They're all shit except for like a couple. Discus of Light and Radagon's Ring of Light are probably the two most underrated spells in the entire game, especially Discus of Light, which I guess they didn't really get much played due to their int faith requirements and how int faith builds barely get any weapon options. And also, yeah, holy damage exists, which speaking of which, they actually made Wrath of the Gods now do holy damage, and it has gone back to having that quicker casting speed, but the radius and the FP cost make it pretty shit outside of a PvP setting. But as for the rest of the Erd Tree incantations, the Crucible spells, Horn and Tail are really fun to use. It's a way to do physical damage, and they do some nice poise damage. Black Blade is a must-have spell for New Game Plus, and Elden Stars can get thrown in the trash. But yeah, Elden Ring Miracles can do large amounts of damage due to there being so many different types of buffs. that can work alongside with them, but they also can be pretty fun too. Number 1, Dark Souls 3. I don't know which silly buffoon of a human being started the rumor of Dark Souls 3 miracles being bad, but they need to get slapped. These spells are amazing. They're probably not going to perform as well as Elden Ring spells, but they get pretty damn close. Like, look at this shit. But the reason as to why they're getting number 1 is that there's so much variety, it has amazing synergy with many builds, weapons, and they're probably just the most fun group of spells to use. Just gonna start off talking about their catalysts. You get access to both chimes and talismans, of which both have their own set of weapon skills, which is something that's actually missing in Elden Ring. Sacred Seals don't get their own skills, but for chimes, you typically get health regen, which getting a health regen without having to waste a spell slot is really good. And with talismans, you typically get poise casting, meaning for a little bit of FP, you can get an uninterruptible attack with any different spell. Any spell can get hyper armor. And these talismans are balanced around this too. You have a talisman that gets more damage but less poise, and a talisman that gets more poise but less damage. And also to mention, there's certain types of talismans and chimes that get intelligence and faith scalings, which makes them have great synergy with these other spell types. And something like the crystal chime can cast sorceries, the white hair talisman can cast pyromancies, and also to mention the Rose of Ariandel. This is a whip that can cast miracles, and its weapon art boosts miracle damage by 25% for 2 minutes, and it's an aura buff, so you can actually switch off it as well. And you combine this buff with all the other crazy buffs that you can get in the game, your damage output can just be insanely high. But to talk about the spells themselves, all the healing and damage negation spells are pretty much the same as the other Dark Souls games, with the exception of Projected Heal, the most fun healing spell ever made, and they need to bring this back for Elden Ring. Tears of Denial is your best support spell. This works the exact same as Denial from Dark Souls 2, but only takes up 2 slots, and it's much cheaper requirement at 12 faith, meaning that you can actually use this with almost every single type of build. Deep Protection is a spell that results in more damage, defenses, and stamina recovery speed. And as for your weapon buffs, you do get Blessed Weapon, which is a pretty cool spell, but it actually does suck. Dark Blade is a way to get dark damage. Sunlight Blade makes a return as Lightning Blade, which I'll never forgive them for, but thankfully it is still good. And Dark Moon Blade finally brought back, but in the worst way possible, rank 3 of a Covenant, which yes, once again, Covenant items with no easy or fun way to acquire offline is just a shit concept. It's still not as bad as Dark Souls 1, as the only spells tied to it are Dark Moon Blade, Great Lightning Spear, and Sacred Oath, which Sacred Oath is a good spell, but thankfully it does only require 10 Sunlight medals, and the weapon art version of Sunlight Straightsword is just as good and acquired in the same area. Now as for the damaging spells, Lightning Spear is probably the best version compared to all the other Dark Souls games due to its bonus damage at closer distance. Sunlight Spear is also no exception. Definitely the best miracle in the game, and thankfully for the first time, it's not tied behind a Covenant. Now yes, it is off the final boss, but this game doesn't throw you straight into New Game Plus, so you actually can go to the Archdragon Peak or the DLCs with Sunlight Spear. Lightning Stake is probably the best spell to get early on, and it can carry you throughout the entire game. The close range does make it pretty risky, but paired alongside a poise casting talisman, then you're good. Lightning Storm is an AoE spell that's going to be for crowd control, because against single targets, it doesn't hit them multiple times. Divine Pillars of Light works the exact same way, but just worse. Wrath of the Gods makes another return, and thankfully, it actually gets the same animation, range, and damage as Dark Souls 1 version, but the casting speed isn't very forgiving, but it is still very viable. Your DLC spells, Way of White Corona and Lightning Arrow, are incredibly fun, but not that powerful as well. Actually, not for Lightning Arrow, that shit's actually really cool. But also, there are actually some int faith-based miracles too. Life Hunt Scythe, Dead Again, very fun spells, although they are very situational as well. But as for Dory's Gnawing, this spell is insane. It does 210 blood loss build-up, which for only 20 FP is ridiculous. You can proc bleed on every boss in like 2 hits. This is me fighting the Ancient Wyvern without much intelligence at all, so my damage isn't even that good, but it's just proccing bleed every other hit, and that percentile damage that it does do is just shredding him. He just dies in a couple of minutes. So yeah, all these spells are just really good and so fun to use, and I don't care what anybody says, Dark Souls 3 miracles are the best. But yes, that is the video now complete. As always, please do like and subscribe, and do follow me on Twitch, because that's where I do all of my marathons. Probably going to do either sorceries or hexes next, so you can just let me know down in the comments which one you would like to see. Anyway, catch you guys around. Bye.